I thought first we would go around the table to do a self-introduction. This is the kickoff town hall event of YANA, the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance. And it's ironic because it was 15 years ago in January, maybe even 15 years ago tonight, that YANA was born in this very room, here in the council room at the Yale Club. A small group got together and challenged each other and wondered what would happen if Yale alumni that were involved and committed to social impact could get together, organize the community, and leverage it for the greater good. And 15 years later, we have really kind of an amazing dream come true, but we have over 8,000 alums worldwide that are involved in some 8 to 10 chapters. Under the new leadership of Rachel Littman, who I'm going to ask to say a few words, but Rachel is our new board chair. And I really feel that the best of YANA is ahead of us, given a new board that is starting off. By the way, on that new board, 19 alums from Chip Levengood, the class of 64, to Khalid Gannon, I believe class of 2017. That's over a 50-year span of alumni engagement, which is just phenomenal.
And I have to say, we've got folks now from Alaska to Florida, and a lot of states in between. So we're growing geographically as well.
Yeah, it's really a remarkable story. So what I'd like to do, actually, you know what? We have so much to talk about tonight. Rather than go around the room, which could take maybe 10 minutes, I'm just going to say that we are here in the council room of the Yale Club. There are about 15 of us around the table. And tonight we're going to talk about an area that really has been kind of one of the most sought after topics that we've had on the drawing board, but we're finally able to get the lineup that could do this topic justice. And we're going to dive right into it. But first, Rachel, I want to introduce Rachel. Rachel, maybe you want to say a few words of welcome to the group, both here at the Yale Club and virtually.
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone, to 2026. I have very large shoes to fill, having taken over the board chair role from Ken, and we're so delighted that he is staying involved with us. We just couldn't let him get too far. We have exciting things we're going to be working on this year. We're always looking for volunteers and donors and folks who can get involved. Our budget is growing, our staff is growing, our programming is solid. And I'm also, Naomi Rutenberg is on, who's our program leader. So if you're interested in any particular programs, our nonprofit mentoring program, our board match, or any of our webinars, let us know. But you'll start seeing those in the emails coming out. Great ways to get involved. And obviously from our annual conference, please keep that in mind. We usually do that at the end, one of the last Fridays in October in New York City. And I'm pretty sure we're going to stick to it again. So thank you for attending. Thank you for supporting YANA. We'll put a link in the chat. We could always use your donations. We do a lot, and we definitely have people we want to keep supporting. There are a lot of nonprofits who need our help, and we are in a great place to do that. And thank you for support. So Ken, I will turn it back over to you, and the speakers are there. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, actually, just one more intro. Kristen Urquiza is YANA's executive director. She's going into her second full year. She's in San Francisco, which gives us a coast-to-coast coverage. Kristen, want to say a few words? Maybe at the end. Maybe I caught her off guard. 3-hour time difference. Okay, here. So let's get into the panel. As I mentioned, to cover a topic this big, nonprofit executive search, you have to get the right people. And I think we hit the jackpot tonight. In no particular order, we've got Marilyn Machlowitz, who is actually a former YANA board member. She's been in search for, she's got a long track record in search, and she's got a lot of stories to share. Melissa Metzel, she's with Do Good, which is a wonderful phrase if you go to her website. It's a phrase that her father would challenge her with when she was a little girl. Melissa, got to do good. And she's carried that and she exemplifies that in her life. And then Jack Lusk, kind of a storied person in executive search. I was actually involved in a search with Jack. He found me for a nonprofit, and I'm forever indebted to him.
He behaved the whole time.
we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. We've got a lot of questions that we gleaned from your registration, so we want to make sure we get to those. And if we have time, we'll get to chat as well. But what I thought we'd do was we assigned each of our panelists with a question in advance on a broad topic that is of general interest. And Marilyn's going to lead off. That is basically, if I'm an aspiring social impact leader, how do I position myself in the eyes of executive search firms? How do I get on their radar screen? Marilyn, take it away.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Rachel. To have all the chairpersons of Yana together one time is just historic. And I see online and on screen many board members. So hello. And fortunately, I'm not doing my Yale dissertation defense here because that was a terrible, terrible room and et cetera, et cetera. We'll leave that alone. So first you have to decide what or which search firms you'd like to be on the radar of. And I say that advisedly because many search firms do 1 or 2 social impact searches a year. So some firms focus on social impact. So you might decide what makes the most sense for you. Additionally, it's hard to keep up. I don't know about both of my colleagues. I hear about a new search firm every week. So good luck. But so first focus. Now, how do you focus on a search firm? Okay. If there are jobs that could potentially ever be of interest to you, whether now or 10 years from now, you notice the search firm name associated with the search, that's a good hint. Search firms also have pretty fulsome websites these days, many of which list what searches they are actually working on. So you can certainly get a gauge from that, or you can ask for suggestions. Now, beyond identifying search firms and keeping sort of a list of those, a running list, a good way to get on the radar of a search firm is to have a client introduce you. Now, who is a client? Well, we only have 3 kinds of people in the world: past clients, present clients, potential clients. So there are a lot of clients out there. And again, I don't want to speak for Jack or Melissa. I very seldom could turn an introduction from a client down, whether it was for their current search that we were working on together, or just in general, please meet, et cetera, et cetera. You will understand that I have met a lot of offspring of clients as well, who might never become candidates for nonprofit search, but I assure you I have met you. And, that's a very good and an easy way to get on the radar because it's effective. I can't tell you how many things in the world are 100% effective. Very few. That is 100% effective. Okay. What's another way? Well, when we're working on a search, we don't just reach out to candidates. We reach out to people who we think can suggest candidates. So we would call them sources, just like journalists call people sources, but a little bit different. So if you know some of the most sought after people in your field, a field of interest, but you doubt that you and they would be going for the same job. Maybe they're not in the market. Maybe they're several levels beyond what you think you would qualify for at this moment. They are great people to let know of your interest, because when they get sourced by a search firm and mention your name, you will hear from the search firm. So that is another great way. Now, Ken probably knows this, but this can work in lots of ways. When his wife, Belinda, was someone I wanted to meet, she was an HR at Goldman, and I met her in probably the least auspicious day for a search person to meet somebody. She said, "Guess what? I became an MD at Goldman today." Well, I knew my prospects were quite limited, but she was for a long time one of the most sought after people in human resources searches. And lo and behold, she got to know me. I got to know her. She referred me to several searches. I got them only because they were after Melinda. They couldn't get her. And she'd say, "Oh, call Marilyn, she'll help you," etc. So this works in lots of fields of life, the most sought after people in your field. Now, there are only 2 more, so don't worry. It's not a lifetime job to get on the radar of search people. Work carefully on your LinkedIn profile and update it, because search firms use LinkedIn like nobody's business. I suspect it is a major revenue generator for LinkedIn. There's a special a subset of LinkedIn called LinkedIn Recruiter that practically, boils water for you. It does, has so many skills that the rest of us don't have. So I can't overstate how important LinkedIn has become. And I've certainly seen the change because I was an early adopter because I had a young candidate who told me I must be on this and whatever. And, you might listen to me. My own daughter doesn't, but you might listen to me. So that's okay. Then simply be perfect for a search. If a search firm has a search and you are perfect for it, you will hear from them till they're blue in the face, you're blue in the face. It'll be hard to get them off your trail. So occasionally that happens. Occasionally you will see a search or hear a search or people will recommend, and you are perfect for it. Does that happen every day? No. But that is surefire. And a search firm will definitely keep you in mind, even if for whatever reason you do not land that job. It is in our advantage and our interest to keep you in mind in the future. That doesn't mean that one should apply for every single job a search firm posts, hoping that that will elicit interest, because then one gets labeled a professional poster. So those are my handy hints, but my colleagues may have others.
I like every single one of the things you suggested. I've always had a sort of, in this vein, a side business, not a business, but I came up in government. I spent 20 years in government before I got into the search business. Translating government experience to not-for-profit and for-profit experience is its own sort of language and effort. And so over the years, I have volunteered in various rooms like this at schools, with government. I've turned over, I don't know, 5 mayoral administrations where people call me and they say, Jack, what am I supposed to do now? And I always ask them the same question, which is, what are you looking to do? So in that vein, it's something I do. I probably have done it once or twice a week for the last 20 years. So you can imagine that I've seen a lot of people. I think what Marilyn's saying about people recommending you is completely helpful and a courtesy that almost all of us in the industry will give to somebody. But the other thing that I just sort of end by saying is try to be in touch with what you want to do. Being scattershot is in trying to meet with a firm, but what Marilyn said about being perfect for search, you don't need to be perfect, but being relevant and doing a little homework and paying attention to who you're talking to can create real relationships. And that's something that I recommend anyway. So there you have it. Very good.
The small thing I would just add is have a hype squad. Have people who know what you want to do and who are going to talk about you. So when I call you, you say, oh, this isn't the thing for me, but Ken, you need to know Ken. And if a recruiter reaches out, even if it's not the job for you, get on the phone, respond to the email, just say something to them, recommend somebody else, give some value, because then that name, your name, will stick in their head when they're working on something in 3 months or in 3 years.
Okay, terrific. Let's keep going. Melissa, you're up next.
Yes.
There are a lot of board members on this call. By the way, over 150 people registered for tonight's session. A lot of them are board members of nonprofits. How should a board decide when to use a search firm or when to go with an internal search, or, using their own resources? At what point is that decision made, and what are some of the factors behind that?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Ken. And I actually think about this both as a search professional, but also as somebody who chaired a search for I am currently the president of the Stonewall Community Foundation Board of Directors. And we went through an executive leadership transition just over a year ago. And we even had to stop and think to ourselves, we have expertise.
Keep going.
Okay, great. We have expertise on the board. Do we need to bring in external experts to do this? Yeah, absolutely. And there are very few circumstances in which it doesn't make sense to use a professional search firm. Now, the exception that comes to mind, and I'm curious if this resonates with either of you, is maybe if It's a very small, very, very small organization. You know, it's going to be an internal transition. The number two of the organization is going to step into the executive director role. But even in that circumstance, I would say it's worthwhile to bring in an external consultant just to do a little bit of some tailored conversations with board members, with staff to understand where the organization is now, where people are hoping to go, and if that internal candidate that people are sort of imagining is right is actually right. So that's maybe the one exception. Generally speaking, though, it is worth it to invest in a search firm. This is a very time-consuming process, and expecting staff to take it on is a tremendous amount of work, or expecting board members to take it on is a tremendous amount of work. So really, the best thing to think about is going with a search firm, but then thinking through, do we need a big Corn Ferry, a huge, one of the really big search firms that's going to charge several $100,000, or do we actually just need a small boutique firm or an individual consultant who can bring us some support? Do we need an interim ED to come in? Do we need a transition consultant? And so I think it's a little bit more of the what next, or what type of support do we get?
I would add, I mean, we're all biased, of course, about using search firms, but oftentimes we get a search assignment after a client has tried to do it themselves.
I was going to say that. Yeah, it's like,
So they've lost time, momentum, perhaps created some ill will in the community or confusion in the community, perhaps created consternation with staff. So, you know, if you have one time to get it right. Now, actually, an external search firm is very happy to consider your internal candidates. And if you're lucky enough to have it, one or more internal candidates, and create a process that gives everybody a fair shake. A search firm is retainer search firm is paid whether the candidate is your internal candidate, someone you surface, someone they surface. So there's no incentive against an internal candidate. And internal candidates are definitely well worth considering. Sometimes, though, they really don't want the job they're applying for. They apply for the job because they think they're supposed to, they think they're expected to, or they really want to say, pay some attention to me. I need some career exposure, some career development, some next steps. This is my only vehicle for letting you know that. So.
listen, my favorite call is the board member or the senior manager at a not-for-profit who says the board's at each other's throats, or if we see one more candidate who we offer the job to and they turn us down, we'll all flip out. There are lots of good reasons for using search. One of them is you almost always get the job done. You do it in a politic and diplomatic way. You try to keep people and you help people actually build a consensus. I think, by the way, that's the best reason to use search, building a consensus on boards. The other thing is that I have found almost inevitably, universally, that boards haven't necessarily focused on what their priorities are until they get into legitimate interviews, i.e. candidates who are qualified. And it's important. That it's so important. I can't tell you how many times, including some that have been public and odd, but I can't tell you how many times I've gotten into a search and you're going along and the board thought they were doing one search and then they realized that's not the search they're doing. They just by talking it through, they realize that they want somebody who has got different experience. I was doing a search for a very large social service organization in Brooklyn where the board's chair was a real estate guy and the board and the organization were having some trouble. So they thought they were going to build their way out by making real estate deals. Well, the search is going along and I'm fine with that. That's what you want. We'll find people who have the right experience. They just forgot to tell me that they had an immutable $5 million retirement fund obligation that they hadn't taken care of that had to be dealt with by the city. Let me just tell you nicely, somebody with a straight real estate background in the private sector is probably not going to negotiate with city agencies or commissioners over how to ameliorate a real serious problem. And the search changed. And it was like you're standing there and I'm going, Eureka, I hear you, but you forgot to tell me about the $5 million. So I really have found time and time again that actual process is something that the board members appreciate, and it gets them to perhaps a different place, but it brings cohesion.
Okay, very good. And then you mentioned cost.
Yeah.
Maybe just give a ballpark. Is it still about a third of salary? Is that, or maybe just speak to that?
That's right. The standard fee is for that to pay a search firm is 1/3 of the first year's salary for the incoming executive. There are additional fees like administrative fees or overhead fees that might be tacked on to that. So it's really important to read the fine print because sometimes those fees might be on a monthly basis. So it's very, very important to look at that. Often those are negotiable too. So, but yeah, 1/3 is pretty standard. And then a lot of firms have a minimum fee. So if the first year ED salary is less than that 1/3 gets to less than their minimum, then they won't take on the search. Or they'll say
Or
that
you could pay the 1/3 of the
Exactly, yeah.
but then you're paying a lot of money.
yeah, exactly. Or they'll say that. So it's important to just really understand what the options are.
However, there are quantity discounts. I mean, sometimes large organizations have multiple searches. Smaller organizations typically only use search for a CEO ED. Larger organizations may use it for direct reports to the EDC. And, it's not unknown to assign more than one search at once. And I certainly believe in quantity discounts, although that sounds more Seventh Avenue than search, I guess.
And smaller firms tend to negotiate more too, right? What we said?
I don't know.
Okay, terrific. Here's another hot button issue. We're in a so-called I agree with this, but in a so-called post DE&I world, in which a lot of that has the conversation there has changed. How has that impacted search? And Jack, I wanted to ask you, as you're placing leaders with respect to color, age, gender, LGBTQ, given the changing climate of DEI, how has the nonprofit executive search process changed?
It's complicated. When I was a kid, that's what the city's corporation council said when the answer had different sides. It's complicated because the DEI issues came to a head. For a firm like mine, I'm sure firms like this, we've been looking at diversity, representing underserved communities, representing the people that are being serviced by an agency, and by having balanced panels and different types of people, whether it's diverse backgrounds or just different business backgrounds. But this came to a head, and we got into what I would say was an awkward place for various reasons, where we had clients who were just talking about DEI, and that's not what their search was. So organizations were tilting over to having a context that was important, but was not necessarily what they were looking to do or what the leader they were looking for was. That's one thing. Two, I happen to be the owner of a search firm for the last 25 years, and I'm who I am. So when I get on a pitch with somebody, even though I might have a diverse operation, and they say, we're only going to hire firms with a certain background, there's nothing I could do. I just say, thank you very much, and move on. The third thing, and that's had some awkwardness over time. The third thing is, starting last year, we started to get some pushback from people, which was very uncomfortable. Some of my clients said, we don't want to talk about DEI, or we don't want to see it in your contract. We don't want to have pushback from our funders. And that created some tension in the searches and created some tension for me, especially some of my staffers who were like, let's tear their throats out. But it's real. And you got to be able to balance that stuff when you're working for somebody, even if you didn't know about it before you started. So it's been out there. And lastly, I would just say, just by who we are and where we are, we make social justice a part of every search we do. And we're very clear about it with our clients so that there's no misunderstanding and misapprehension.
That's very helpful. Thank you for being so personal about it. I would say at DRG, DEI is in our DNA. And I like that with all those D initials, I have to admit. But that means every search has a diverse panel of candidates. It just is inevitable in this work and this world. So that is not an issue. It's not a problem or anything of that nature. Now, I would say of all the criteria Ken listed, age is the last frontier. And I don't think the age issue is readily resolved. And I don't know that I would actually hear people say absolutely too young, too old. But believe me, it goes on. And the older I have gotten, I'm way past that cutoff for too old. The too old cutoff has been moving younger and younger and younger. And it is actually shocking to me. And I can see nodding heads. And I've heard this from people I consider quite young. And they're telling me that there is age discrimination. And I honestly think they're right. I think this is a bigger frontier than sexual orientation, race, etc., have been for a while. I think that is much more accepted. And the age thing is perhaps an issue that's going to play out or be resolved in the next few years. Hasn't been made worse by recent political events, if one thinks of a certain debate a year and a half ago, give or take? Yes, I think it probably has. Now, DRG offers every client, I can't say 100% take up, a session on unconscious bias. Well, actually, we call it hiring with reduced bias. And in a certain way, that can merge and meld, although we don't talk about DEI in it. We may talk about certain halos that we put on candidates, and you all may have certain halos. I was totally guilty of this for much of my career. If someone had Hunter High School on their resume, I was like on the floor impressed. If they had been a White House fellow, I was incredibly Rhodes Scholar. All these things have impressed me. They have very little to do with accomplishing a job. So once I took the training and I realized that was a sort of now it's conscious, but all right, it's unconscious bias of mine, I had to let it go. So we probably all have these, and they may be around things that are really not relating to the job, etc. So we have to, think about that as well. But if someone can solve or resolve or offer insight into the age issue, I will totally appreciate that.
Thank you both for those. The one thing that I would add is that I think candidates, and I do a lot of recruiting of candidates of color, of candidates who have queer identities, of candidates who have historically not had great experiences with recruiters. And what I hear from so many of the candidates that I speak with is that they want to be taken seriously. They're going to ask more extensive and specific questions about the experience, what it's going to be like working in an organization, because they're very tired of being tokenized. And so these are things that, as we talk about the post-diversity, equity, and inclusion world that we may or may not live in, these are things that are real and that are coming up every day for people. It's just this sort of recognition that the way that people have been treated is not going to fly any longer. And so that's something that's coming up in a very real way. And I think it pushes the clients and the organizations that I work with to have to really look in the mirror and ask themselves some very, very hard questions about the culture of their organization, the relationship between the board and the leader, and the relationship between the staff and the leader, and how all of that plays out financially, how all of that plays out with values, how all of that plays out in the day-to-day experience of the organization.
Very good. Okay, getting to some questions that were floated by the people that were registering. One that came up quite a few times is you have more and more people from the private sector seeking positions in social impact and nonprofit. What advice do you have for them, and how do they get, past that barrier, past that conception, maybe misconception, that they can't adjust to essentially a new?
Why are you smiling?
Any thoughts on that?
I've developed some relatively rigid rules over the years. not that I so much, it's my how to help people. I've talked to hundreds of people who are thinking about transition from for-profit to not-for-profit, but many of them expect me to do their homework for them, or they don't really understand sort of what is a parallel universe with its own cultures and with its own whole set of priorities. And as a result, the reason I was smiling is I always ask people, have you served on a board? In particular, have you served on a development committee, i.e. raising money, or have you served on the finance committee, making sure that the organization is running reasonably well? If you haven't had that experience, and you haven't, on top of that, volunteered in the arena in which the organization is working, then I urge them to do that so that they can get the kind of experience that makes sense. Because people have, I think, in my sort of long-term view of this, people don't necessarily understand that nonprofits are businesses that run towards their own priorities and towards getting their job done. And the people who work there take it very seriously. And it's sometimes hard for somebody who's been in the for-profit sector and doesn't have that kind of exposure to be able to sort of meld with the team.
Well, Jack,
Did I say that diplomatically?
I think you're completely right about if they've had no exposure, no experience, nothing to talk about, etc. The second bounce is much easier. I mean, if we see somebody who has been for profit and has gotten into non-for-profit and now wants another job, progressive job in non-for-profit, that's a pretty much a safer bet. And we will go for that. Also, the reasons one gives for leaving for profit and not-for-profit, we better hear something other than I want to give back, because that gets very old, every day. We want to hear more than I love the mission. Loving the mission may be necessary, but not sufficient. Now, there are easier and more difficult jobs to transition from and to. So if you're in finance, that is perhaps the easiest. Numbers are numbers. If you are in financial services and you'd like to be the CFO of a foundation, which happens to be a wonderful job, you will probably tell me it's the easiest job you've ever had because there's one source of revenue, which is the endowment. Okay, one revenue stream. If you're in communications in a for-profit, that is not impossible. Communications, you'll have fewer resources. And I used to ask people, okay, what do you do when you have to do this? And they said, well, I go to the department down the hall. So I said, wait, there's no department down the hall. There's no hall. Essentially, let's figure this out. Human resources. So I'm saying the staff areas, the administrative areas, more than what I'll call the program areas, are a much simpler transition. Not a glide path, but a simpler, more common, easier to make transition.
In the interest of time, I think these were great answers. So you want to keep going with other questions?
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Another thing
this.
another thing that came up is any advice for nonprofit boards to develop leadership internally rather than recruiting externally. Right? I mean, is there a formula for that, or is seeking external talent inevitable? Or can that be part of the culture of succession to try and grow it in?
Staff will often say and object to the tendency of boards to think they should go outside for senior leadership. But I would also put it on boards, like any of us, tend to see people in the way they've seen people. So if you've been the chief development officer, and you might be a terrific candidate to be the CEO, but the board may be loath to have to look for another chief development officer, may be unwilling to lose you as chief development officer, and may frankly only think of you as chief development officer. So I think it requires the current executive director, current CEO, to make sure the board is exposed to and experiences some of the successes and breadths of the staff, and to give them some opportunities to demonstrate or develop other skills than their relatively narrow silo.
I would add building in a culture of succession planning at multiple levels, not just when it comes to the CEO or executive director, but for the C-suite, for other roles, making it a very normal thing to talk about progression within the organization, to talk about the fact that people leave, and that's okay. We celebrate with the time that they've been with us and they move on. That's okay. Normalizing change and helping to build into each person's performance plan and work plan for every year that they are skill building with the goal of getting somewhere eventually, even if somewhere is with another organization. And so I think just normalizing that change can help to alleviate some of that enthusiasm that comes from bringing in people from outside, recognizing that people from inside can change roles, and that's okay.
There's one don't that I really, it's allied, it's not direct, but let me just say, there's a don't, which is do not get staff involved in searches for CEOs. It's a mistake. It is inevitably going to cause problems internally, and most likely that person will not be there a year later. And I've seen this all over the country, and I've seen it be a real problem in searches because staff doesn't mean to be defensive. Staff doesn't mean to play favorites or try to push a particular candidate on a board. But often that's what happens. And I'm very conservative about this issue. I've done my share of very large and very small searches for leaders. And I always tell boards the same thing, which is it's your responsibility. It's your biggest obligation as a board member. Keep it. You want advice from the staff, ask them for advice, but keep them out of the voting. And I feel strongly about that.
I agree with you.
And I actually don't.
Good.
Hot topic. So no, I think that not having the staff at the table can be a problem, especially because board members tend to not know what the day-to-day experience of the executive director CEO is. They often don't know what the job is and think so much in their soul that they do. And so then when there's not somebody who's a part of the conversations on a regular basis saying, this is what our actual fundraising pipeline looks like. This is what our actual culture looks like internally. And I think it can be a real disservice to the candidates coming in. And it can also make it harder for the person who steps into that role to be welcomed by the staff. Now, there are some circumstances where I think it makes sense to figure out other mechanisms for the staff to have that voice. I am a very, very strong believer in incorporating a lot of staff participation, even if there are not representatives on the staff, on the search committee. But I think that it does often lead to a failure to stick for CEOs and executive directors, especially when we're looking at organizations that talk about progressive values, that talk about DEI values. I think that that's where there can be some significant backfires.
Well, I think we're all agreeing that having staff members on the search committee is not conducive to success because, well, there's search committee, search people making this search, because you need your search committee to have candor with each other, with the search consultant, if any, and having staff members there will generally compromise the candor. I think we all agree that there are ways to utilize staff, and staff wants to have a voice, absolutely, in the search, but they don't necessarily deserve a vote or a veto. And that is a tension. Now, we've done it in lots of different ways. We've had a finalist candidate meet the search key leaders, et cetera, but we have that as a sort of chaperoned exercise. And we encourage it not to be seen as an interview to grill the incoming or potential, et cetera. These discussions happen literally every day. What if you have two lead candidates? Do you have two meet senior staff? And then what if senior staff prefers A and the search committee prefers B? Well, then you have like a mutiny before anything happens. So it is a very, very tricky, tendentious area. And in nonprofit, I think, especially because when I worked in for-profit long ago, I never expected to pick my boss. I was lucky if my boss picked me, or kept me or anything like that. It didn't even occur to me, but it is absolutely an expectation and an entitlement that I see in nonprofit organizations. So I am, I understand the conflicts. I do agree with you, Melissa, that boards don't know as much about the organization as they should, but they have to get to know. Part of doing the search and prepping the search is how they learn much more. I worked for a very impressive search committee at one time that actually undertook a study of 10 peer-like organizations about what they needed in their executive director before they even began the search. And they did staff surveys, interviewings, this kind of thing. And I admired that. I think they did a careful job to make sure they did know something. And that is what the board should know more. We agree. The board often doesn't, but they need to know more before they do the search.
Okay, another big topic. We talked a lot here about success. Not all searches go well. Maybe each of you could share an example of a hire, whether an ED or a CEO, ahead of a nonprofit in which it just didn't work out. And what the reason was, and any backstory that you can share.
Happy to jump in while my colleagues are thinking carefully, I can tell. That is another reason to use a search firm, because if a search firm hired, recruited exec, fails, leaves, departs, whatever the word should be, within usually the first year,
That's correct.
the search firm will undertake another search, a replacement search at no cost. So that is like an insurance policy. You never hope to use your insurance policy, but it's awfully good to have it. If you're doing the search on your own, you're like blinded, dumbfounded, stuck, don't feel confident about doing it again. It's sort of a mess. Similarly, it's perhaps not well known, but many offers are not accepted. So again, when a search, internally organized search gets a turn down, again, they're sort of stuck. Where do we go from here? Search firm is used to candidates withdrawing, turning down, and it's just they, pick up and go. But I had a client who called me. They had a long-term leader. They had done a search with somebody else, and the person only lasted a year. And we did the successive search, and the person lasted about 11 years. I think the 1-year person they made a common mistake. They hired someone who worked at a foundation, thinking that a person who worked at a foundation could raise money.
Yeah.
I think a foundation may mean they have some foundation contacts, which is fine, but they've been giving away money. They have not been raising money. These are very different activities. And I think it was a natural, naive assumption. And many people who haven't worked a lot with foundations or a lot of nonprofits would immediately have that thought. I don't blame them for having a thought, but they pay a high price for having that thought.
The most egregious situation we ever ran into was we did the state Planned Parenthood lobbying organization up in Albany. And we went through the search and got somebody. And virtually at the same time that this person was supposed to start, the long-term chair of the board, who neglected to even mention he was looking for a job, took another job. And the board fell into disarray. And the person who was hired said, nah, these guys are great, but this isn't for me at this juncture, given what I see. So now you put me in a situation where I advised the board to spend 6 months or whatever amount of time it took to reorganize themselves, get their heads together, and figure out who they were, because the long-term chair had kind of left them completely at sea. So the truth is, the second time we did the search, it worked out really well. In fact, the person who was in that job became one of the previous governor's top people. We try to see things like that, but my view of that is couldn't control it, want to help the board, don't want to get into a difficult situation. So, call time out. The board was very grateful. We got it together and within a year, and no cost to them, just be clear, we got it back together. We really try. I mean, this is the source of sore points with search firms, especially boutiques. Your goal is to be successful. every single time. It's not a matter of numbers. It's not a matter of anything. It's both pride, professional competence, and the view that you're trying to help an organization. So if it doesn't work, that means there was a gap. And when you see those gaps, there's various reasons for it, but Marilyn said it exactly correctly. You jump back in and you do it and you try to help the people because it's not easy.
We lose sleep over the fact. I have colleagues who, if a candidate walks into a job and it ends for whatever reason in less than a year, not at the candidate's choice, and even at the candidate's choice, we lose sleep over those situations because we don't want to take someone who's in a thriving career, interest them in something that they and you hope will be at least as satisfying, probably more so, and have it be disappointing because then it's not a win-win-win. Ideally, search is win-win-win. Society benefits, the organization benefits, the individual candidate benefits. That's a lose-lose-lose, and so we lose sleep over those situations.
The example that comes to mind is not actually a search that I led, but I think there's some instruction in it for us. An organization brought in a very high profile new CEO and sort of a splashy celebrity in our world, splashy name. And she came in expecting to be the external face of this organization. And once she arrived, she found out actually a lot of time and energy needed to be spent internally. She brought in her own team and did a bunch of staff turnover with her own people to lead the internal changes to address the financial issues that may or may not have even been shared with her during the process. And it didn't stick. It did not stick. And so part of that was because she really was walking into a different job than she realized. And so that's that piece of transparency, of information sharing, of real talk. As the search goes on, those things are just so critical to someone being able to understand what they're walking into. And especially if they're really committed to the organization, they're willing to take on whatever the challenges are, but it's just, they need to know what they're walking into.
Okay, terrific. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up to the audience here in the room, as well as the virtual audience. But this came up, and that is, if you're a candidate and you've been offered the position from the search firm, from the organization, and it's a certain compensation package, how negotiable are the elements of the package? And how should, if there is any upward possibility, how should the candidate try to negotiate that?
The first thing I'll say is that if it is a search firm that's leading the process, partner with the recruiter. You can ask very candid questions to the recruiter. They're your partner too as a candidate. And so it's absolutely fair game. We've all had these conversations with candidates. So it's okay to say, is there any flexibility on this? I know this is the top of the range that they publish, but really, is there flexibility on this? Maybe there's not. Would they consider a signing bonus? Would they consider additional PTO time or other sorts of incentives to make this work financially? The other thing to consider is for this level, having a contract. Not all organizations in the nonprofit space are used to having their CEOs and EDs on a contract, but have a contract and make sure that it includes an exit package, that it includes any other sort of coaching, professional development that might not be in the contract, but that can be part of the broader package. So thinking about those different pieces to add on are important.
I was just going to say, look, the environment's changed in the last 2 years, and it's relatively important. What happened was the state said that you have to publish the salary. Okay? The problem with that is that you don't get to know what people are making, also by state edict. So everybody has been asking for the top of the range. They just come in and ask for the top of the range. Your question is totally appropriate. Like, it's New York. Why wouldn't you ask for the top of the range? Mm-hmm. However, your boards have to think about this, and they have to think about whether you should reel back the salary sum so that it's more realistic to be able to take a question like, well, if you put the top of the range 150 to 175 and the top is 175 and we want to pay somebody 190, do we have room? do we want to start it at 150 to 165 so we have room to go to 175 for the right person? It's a moving target, but it's fed by something that's is good intentioned, but it's created a problem for the organizations because sorting this and actually finding out, by the way, I read 990s to put myself to sleep. Finding out what people are making is complicated. And so that adds a layer to this, which I have to tell you, is very real.
But I think, as in other organizations, even in nonprofits, it's worth thinking about total compensation because it can be shocking, at least to me, how generous some benefits in nonprofits are. For instance, I had one client that paid 25% into people's 403B, which is the equivalent of 401k. Now, 25% is the top of the range I've heard of, to be honest. And it wasn't immediately, weren't immediately eligible. It was after 2 years. And I said, well, in reality, that's not a recruiting incentive. That's a retention tool. It's not comp. But in any event, the same point pertains. Find out total rewards because you may be staggered by what the rest of the package includes. But I think the publishing of transparency, salary transparency, although it has some difficulties, is one of the best boons I've seen in search since I started. I think it's only about 8 years old in New York. It's not prevalent in every state. It so lessens the anxiety about searching through old 990s and figuring out, and can they afford me? Am I wasting my time? And I think not asking people's salary. I had a client once who, in the days when one could ask salary, although it was very uncomfortable for me. I was brought up in Philadelphia and asking everybody within 3 seconds of me, then what do you earn? It was very uncomfortable for me, but anyway. And he had taken a big pay cut. And he was well below the range. And she said, I'm not going to penalize him for doing good by lowering our range. Now, she was probably extraordinary. And you would all know who this candidate has become and has been. But, that was an extraordinary experience. But I still think it's basically improving in terms of equity and ability to discuss these things, but don't wait till the end. If you are talking about a job with a recruiter or with an employer, this conversation should be part from the beginning. What are they thinking? You could even ask what's flexibility like in the first or second conversation. It shouldn't be a surprise at the end. It shouldn't be a surprise to the candidate. It shouldn't be a surprise to the hiring organization. And if things like relocation are in the mix, that can be very expensive. And finding out what's entailed. If there's a delayed start, how does that affect the relocation benefit? The more complex sometimes one's family situation is. I used to dread hearing, people say, oh, I have 3 children. I'm thinking, how are they going to afford 3 children in New York? What kind of space do they need? And I had one candidate a long time ago said, I want the same situation I have where I live. I want a townhouse in walking distance to work. And I said, easy, it's not going to happen. Easy, impossible. So be realistic, have these discussions, think about cost of living, housing prices, et cetera, et cetera. It really does matter. Find out waiting periods for benefits. That is like the trickiest thing because you want benefits that start really day one, but some organizations don't have that. So it's worth finding out about all these things. It is not rude to ask. It is not premature to ask. You can ask the recruiter to send the benefits summary. Most organizations have their benefits, online someplace, not for everybody for public view, but you can have them in 30 seconds and you will know a lot more.
Okay, terrific. Some great takeaways. Let's open it up to the room. Yes.
Thank you very much. This is informative in ways I hadn't even imagined.
Say your name.
Yeah, I'm Emmanuel Darcourt. I work in public health, and one of my areas of experience and academic interest is the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And the reason I mention that is because there's no correlation or an inverse correlation between what people actually did in terms of helping people and including leadership roles and how people promoted themselves. successfully. So you can be sure that if someone mentions Ebola response in their Wikipedia page, they probably did nothing or very little. And likewise, the people who really saved thousands of lives are unknown. So I'm curious to know, that, and as a European, the image is always that Americans are good at self-promoting. And the question is that an issue when you do searches of distinguishing the talkers from the doers?
Yes.
And how do you do it then?
Well, I generally think that it's a soup, that there's people's experience, there's their personalities, there's what the organization is trying to do, and it's how they present themselves. There is one thing I seem to have the caveat business. The one thing that I found in search, which is very complicated, is people who have pre-existing psychological issues. It's much more prevalent. Adults know how to hide personality excess. That was a good word. But you get in situations where people don't respond well once they're in the job, even though they talk themselves into the job. And that's pretty complicated because it's not readily visible. And I've run into that a few times. I replaced somebody in a public agency where they got hired, national search. They had really good reputation. They went into their office and shut the door and never came out. And they had to fire that person, and for good reason. I mean, but this was a group of the smartest people you can imagine. They had no sense, even through the process, that they were dealing with somebody who might have a pre-existing issue. So for me, the question of whether people oversell, that works itself out in the wash. You can find out, you read about the people, you get references. Maybe we can talk about that too, but references for me have always turned out to be a much more useful resource than people imagine. So people always say to me, they gave you 3 references and that they're their friends. And I have found nuances in references over the years are extremely helpful. And I'll just tell you, the top of my board is I brought somebody to work for the Coalition of the Homeless a couple of years ago from California. And the 2 references I talked to out there, people who work for different organizations, they both said the same thing. They said they'd moved to New York to work for them.
Wow.
And I said, okay, you just rang the bell. Thank you very much. That's as good as I'm going to get. And that's, you listen for that stuff. I'm just giving you the envelope, but sorry for stealing the floor, but that.
I would say one of the things that's useful in that as a recruiter, what I do, I listen for a lot of details. And so that means that I'm pulling into the nitty gritty. How many dollars did you raise? How did you raise them? What was the percentage from each different revenue stream? Who did you ask? Who worked with you to do that? So it's like really digging in because it's hard to make up that many details. And so it's very easy to give flowery language of this is what I would do if I were in this role. This is how I would, but really what have you done in the past? In excruciating detail is how, because then as recruiters, we've seen so many different profiles across so many people that we know. We're like, oh, okay, actually you have an overinflated title right now, or you think you raised a lot of money, but in the scheme of this organization, you didn't actually raise that much. Things like that.
Well, Melissa is absolutely right. Go beyond the assertions of what was done for demonstrations of what was done. And with the money raising is a particularly good example because you could get 3 people, 3 different successive development directors at one organization who all claimed credit for $100 million gift.
Yeah.
And the reality is they probably all played a part. $100 million gift does not come in overnight, just by chance. So they probably did all work. But if anyone tells you that start to finish,
An example.
in 5 months, they got $100 million gift, I don't think they did.
Hi, so I'm Emily Sachs, and I work as an interim executive at a lot of places. So I'm working with boards and staff while they are doing recruiting. And one of the things I notice is that sometimes the board will want to invest all of their energy and resources into the celebrity who they're, and I don't mean literal celebrity, but the person that they're,
Yeah.
celebrity who they're bringing in to be the leader. But that person, if they're really going to lead the organization, is going to need a lot of resources, a team, usually infrastructure resources, a lot of resources. And so I'm always encouraging the board to be realistic about the fact that it's not just the investment in the leader, but it's the investment in all the things that the leader is going to need to enable her or him to achieve the goals.
Provably, demonstratively true.
So I think sometimes it's just helpful to share with the board that it's a big, it's not just the salary and comp of the leader, but it's all those other things that are going to need to also be.
Well, I think it's great that you're an interim. And initially, when I first started hearing about interims during a search, sometimes, which yours may not always be there, I thought, gee, why do they need one? And then I realized, well, gee, what a good idea. Because otherwise, if you don't have an interim executive brought in, what happens for leadership then? You might ask two staffers to share it, and then you want them to go back to their natural resting places. Or you might want one person to be interim and she or he would like the job, but they don't get the job. So then you have a departure. Or a board member might say, well, I have the time, I'll step in. Well, not always feasible, not always workable, not always, etc. So an interim solves all of those things and also takes a little time pressure off the search. So that if the candidate chosen is someone you have to wait 6 weeks for, which is not uncommon, you can wait 6 weeks, perhaps without everything falling apart. So DRG just started an interim division, not just for interim CEOs or EDs, which used to be the most prevalent use, but now there's interim everything, interim HR, interim development, interim financial, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a growing trend. It also overlaps with what's called fractional executives in some ways. And I think there'll be more in the future. So I'm thrilled to hear that you're doing it.
Okay, we've got a great set of questions from the virtual audience, all related to the theme of people that were working in the federal government that have been laid off and that want to make the transition to
You
nonprofit.
should call Jack.
Yeah.
Ways to position themselves in the best possible way. Jack, you want to lead up on that?
Yeah. Let me just say, I did a couple searches in the same time period that a lot of these layoffs, and I was shocked and surprised that people didn't apply for jobs. And that was, I came to believe that people either thought that this too would blow over or they were frozen. But I did some obvious searches for people from Washington with either international or various political backgrounds. And I was really surprised, stymied. I mean, I know a lot of people down there. It wasn't like I wasn't reaching out. We did advertising. So that's one piece. I think a lot of people are over that. I've talked to quite a few people from Washington. I myself was somebody who came from the federal government to New York to city government, and there's transition, but I think this is an excellent time for people to join the Mondani administration, to look for jobs as people transition. It's going to be a year of transition in New York, and a lot of opportunity. I think that there's a translation issue, which is what I've talked about before. The same translation issue between for-profit and not-for-profit exists with federal government and city government or state government, as well as a certain age. And I used to use the acronyms that you use in Washington. I particularly came out of the FAA, and I was throwing them around City Hall for about 10 days. And a certain person put his arm around me and he said, Jack, you could probably stop that now because nobody knows what the heck you're talking about. So my point being, every government has its own acronyms. They have their own sort of pieces. So you got to sort of unbind that. But I I would love to see some more people with Washington experience up here. There are opportunities, and by and large, they're really smart people. The only thing that often comes up is they don't have fundraising experience. So you got to kind of balance that. But that's
Can we just see how easy it is to get fundraising experience? If you want to volunteer for a school that you went to, a school that one of your children goes to or went to, no one's going to say no. It's very easy. If someone says something like a shared 25th year reunion class, people pay attention to that. That's like raising big bucks. That's like major gifts.
One thing I would just quick tactical thing that I would add to what you're saying, Jack. Translating resumes is very important to get seen. And so if you are coming out of the federal government and your resume has all of the acronyms and has all of the data points that it just reads federal government, then the organizations that are looking at your resume might need a little help understanding what that means. And so it's worth investing $250 to work with somebody to translate your resume.
Yes.
I see the same thing for people coming out of the UN.
yes.
Or coming out of academia. I mean,
Academia as well, yeah.
or any field that you're going into another field, you want your resume to resemble ones they're used to seeing. And you want them to say, oh, yes, I can see how that transfers and that translates. And some of them, we just can't do that. Also, if part of your resume is from another nation, titles can be very different. Relationships, roles can be very different. It's worth being a little bit helpful.
Okay, we're past the hour, but I wanted to ask one kind of lightning round question to each of the panelists. And that is, and it came from the audience, but one piece of advice would you want every candidate to know? Just top of the head.
Be enthusiastic.
Great.
Take every interview seriously, even if you think it's just a screening interview on the phone with a junior person you'll never see again.
Do your research.
Also good.
Right. So with that, how about a big hand for our panelists? Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us online. And this has been recorded, and you'll be able to see the edited version in the days or weeks to come. Thank you. Rachel, you wanted any closing thoughts?
Thank you to our speakers. Thanks for folks joining us live. And looks like we have, we had over 40 people online. So thank you for starting our year off with a bang. We hope to see you at future YANA programs and get more deeply involved with YANA. Look